Welcome, ACUA members. This webcast is part of a quarterly series that Automation Services hosts as part of our strategic partnership with ACUA in an effort to bring ACUA members together to share their knowledge of IDEA and data analysis. Thank you for joining us today as Susan Jago, Senior Auditor at Ohio University, shares how they use IDEA to streamline departmental audits. She and her department has had many wins, and we're thrilled that she is available to share them with us. If you have any questions, please type them in the question box on the right side of your screen. We will try to answer them at the end of the webcast. This webcast is being recorded. We will be sending out the slides, the recordings, and any reference documents within the next day. Welcome, and I am going to now turn control over to Susan. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Lindsay. I want to thank ACUA and Automation for giving us this opportunity to learn from each other during these virtual user group webinars. I will say that when I first started using IDEA, attending the Central Ohio user group meetings really jump-started my ability to find new projects to use data analysis in our day-to-day activities. While watching auditors from various industries walk through projects they performed, I was able to say, wow, we don't do that, but I could use this same functionality in something that we've been wanting to do. So it's been a wonderful opportunity to learn from other people who are using the software. I highly recommend, if you don't have a user group in your area, you can contact Automation. They will try to help facilitate developing a group. And it's just a wonderful way to learn to do a lot more. And so with that, we'll get started. Oh, there we go, sorry. Our objectives today are, we're going to talk about conducting an audit of the appropriateness of credit limits based on the actual spending. All or most universities have P-cards, Pro cards, travel cards, some sort of a credit card process for their employees to make purchases. And they have a lot of inherent risks, so they need to be monitored and they need to be controlled. And one of those risks is the outstanding credit that is out there to be utilized if someone wants to engage in bad behavior. So we're going to see how to use IDEA to rather quickly determine whose credit limits are appropriate and whose are not. We'll look at appending fields and see how to utilize macros. If we have time, I may talk a little bit about how to create a macro. If not, you certainly can find that information on Automation's website. And we're going to understand the following functions in IDEA: at right or at left, the at max, and the complicated if function. These are all functions that I use in this audit. So what I have here in IDEA, I have a transaction file, and this data has all been sanitized, names have been removed. I have the credit limits, and these names have all been created. So I got a list out on the website, plugged them in, so this is not real data. And the credit limit listing came from our bank software where credit card transactions are processed. And of course the credit limits came from our central system. So they don't necessarily match up really well. So we need to find a way to join the two files in order to do any sort of analysis between the two. If you look at the credit limit file, it has the employee ID on it. However, the credit limit listing has actually a redacted version, which we've gotten fixed in the information that we now get, but I left this in here because it just gave us an extra step to go through so you can see, if you run into this type of situation, how you need to handle that. So the first thing that we have to do is I'm going to add a field using the at right function. The at right function identifies the specified number of characters in a field that you want to use, and the syntax would be at right, the string, or the field name, and then the number of characters that you want to include. So what I'm going to use is the @right, and I'm going to use the employee ID, and I'm going to ask for the last 5 digits. I've already done this on the transaction file just to save us time, but to walk you through this, when you want to append a field in IDEA, you can double-click on any non-linked field, and this box will pop up, and it gives you the opportunity to actually append a field, which we're going to call the last 5 ID. It's going to be a virtual number, and this is where you put in the function. So we do @right, and when you get the function that you want, if you hit enter, it puts your cursor between the parentheses where you'll start entering the criteria. But if you know the function you want to use, but you can't quite remember what the syntax is for the function, you get here and it doesn't tell you that anywhere, but if you just move out of the parentheses and back in, you can see here that it's now got the syntax in there for you. And so I'm going to use the employee ID, and we need 5 digits. I always click the evaluate button whenever I do a function just to make sure I'm getting what I'm expecting to get. And then you click OK, the check mark, and click OK. Oops, sorry. This is a virtual character. The reason I'm going to end up with a number, but the reason I'm using a virtual character instead of a number is because we're not going to be doing any math with this number. If you need to do any kind of calculations, you would want to use the virtual number. And so now you see we have a new field, which matches the one in our transaction file. So now we want to join these 2 files, and we're going to use the credit limit transaction file as our primary file. That's because this is the many, and so we want to link the credit limits to each and every transaction. And to do that, we're going to do a join. And just like Excel or any other software today, you have multiple ways of doing that. And one of those is to use the ribbons in your analysis. And here are all your functions that you can use, and one of those is join. Another option is I like to keep the quick access bar set up here of the functions that I use the most, then I don't have to go look for them. So we're going to do a join, and our secondary file will be the credit limits. And the fields that I want from this, when you do a join, it's going to choose all of the fields. You don't necessarily need all of those, so make sure that you're only getting the fields you need, otherwise you end up with duplication. And because I didn't have any names in the transaction file, I'm going to add those. And then I also want to include the monthly credit limit amount and the transaction credit limit amount. I'm going to choose all the records in the primary file because I need all of the transactions in order to do my analysis. This is a listing of all transactions that were processed during an entire year. And you know, especially in the academic world, our transactions may vary dramatically throughout the year. A professor who maybe is teaching throughout the academic year may be traveling all during the summer and so has no transactions in, say, October, but has a lot of transactions in June or July. So we want to make sure we get an entire year in order to make sure the analysis is proper. And I'm just going to call this transactions with credit limits. And you have to tell it what to match on, which is going to be that last 5 ID that I created. Because they need to be identical, I can't use the last 5 in the one file and the full in the first file. And so now we have a file. It has the names, it has the dates of the transactions and the amounts, and it also has each employee's credit limit on each of the transactions. So that will allow us to do analysis utilizing data from both the bank system and our own systems. And the first thing that we want to do is a summarization. What we're going to look at first is determining if the largest transaction is appropriate for single transaction limits. Because of course cards have two limits generally. They'll have a single transaction and they'll have a monthly transaction limit. And we're going to test the single transaction first. So I'm going to summarize, and again you can use your ribbon or your quick access. And what I'm going to summarize on is the employee ID. I don't have to use the last 5 anymore because I have both of those in this field, in this file. And we're going to call this the employee maximum transaction. As you go through these analyses and you're doing a lot of joining and merging and adding and extractions, you want to make sure that you're very clear on your names of your files. Otherwise, you're going to start to get confused at which one you should be using. So make it as clear as possible as you go along. So summarization can be used for a number of things. And one of them is simply to get a unique list of whatever the data is that you're using. If all you need is a list, if I just wanted a list of all the card holders, I would not click any of the numeric fields to total. And that just gives you a list of it with removing all of the duplicates. But in this case, we're going to be using the transaction amount. And you can then look for maximum, minimum, average variance, or standard deviation. And we want to know what the maximum is. So it's going to tell us what the largest transaction each of these employees has had. And the fields we're going to include in this one are the last name, first name. We won't need employee ID because that's what we're summarizing on, and we want the single transaction amount limit. Now, because our minimum standard card transaction limit is $1,500, we don't need to do any sort of analysis on anyone with that limit because we're not going to lower it anything below that. So we're going to do what's called a direct extraction, and that will allow us to pick our criteria to limit our data. So this is the limit is greater than our standard. And you click on the little calculator to do your formula. And we want the single amount to be greater than 1,500. I want to point out that you never want to put commas in any of your numbers in the equation editor. If you put a comma in, the idea believes that it's a separator, and you will end up with results that aren't at all what you were expecting. When you're doing an extraction, the number 1 means that whatever record you're looking at, which in this case it's the first record, fits the criteria. If it was a 0, that would mean that the first record did not fit your criteria. And that's one way to check to make sure that your equation was correct. And you can see up here the first record was $24.99, so that's correct. And so now we have a list of only those with a single transaction limit greater than 1,500. Now we want to limit credit limits as much as possible to reduce the risk to the university, but we also don't want to create an administrative burden by making people constantly having to go to the procurement department to get temporary increases when they need to book something or purchase something that is above their limits. So you want those limits to be reasonable for what the individual's business purchases are. So what we decided to do was we would only recommend a reduction if the individual had not used at least 50% of their credit limit. So that way, if they've never even used at least 50%, we can feel pretty comfortable that they probably will not be doing a lot of business above that in the future. So in order to do that, we want to append a field. And this is going to be called 50% limit. This will be a numeric. And what we want to do is just take the single limit and multiply that by 50%. So now we can see who is using that above that limit by utilizing some more functionality. We're going to append, or first we're going to do a direct extraction. So this is max less than 50%. So if they have used more than 50% of their individual transaction limit, we're not going to mess with them. We're going to leave them just as they are. So we want only those records where the maximum is less than, is less than the 50% limit. All right, so here you look at this first one. Their maximum transaction in a 12-month period was $673.75. Their current limit is $24.99, and half of that would be $12.50. So they meet our criteria as a recommendation for reduction because they're not utilizing the level of limit that they currently have. So now what we need to do is say, what should their limit be? And to do that, we use something that's called the complicated if. The complicated if evaluates the records for multiple conditions and determines what the appropriate response is. The order is very important because whichever criteria is accurate first is the one that's going to be processed, and then it won't look at any others. And this is actually what we use. This is the formula that we use to do it. And so what it will do, it will first look if the transaction posted amount is greater than or equal to $5,000. And remember, thinking about the 50% limit, we're going to recommend a $10,000 limit, transaction limit for them. Obviously, those are going to be few and far between within the university, but there may be some individuals that do need to have that kind of a limit. And then it will go down through the rest of the limits on there in order to determine the appropriate limit. So we're going to append a field, and this is going to be recommended single limit. And I've cheated and copied and pasted this because I didn't figure you wanted to sit there and watch me type this and make errors. So it's much easier if you have it to just copy and paste it. So you can see this first card, which if you remember correctly, highest transaction was $673. We're going to recommend the lowest limit for them because they're not utilizing the higher limit that they have. And now you see the majority of these have all been lowered down to our minimum transaction. I think you know across the university, a lot of times people look at their credit limits on their P cards as a rite of passage as opposed to something that they need to do business. This is trying to get back to the basics of only giving the credit limits that they need to do the job that they've been hired to do. And you can stop here and give this list to procurement, and they can take it from there, contact the departments, work through all of these. But we wanted to find out just what the risk savings would be in this case. So I'm going to append another field, and this is going to be called the single limit reduction. And so all I'm going to do is take the current limit and subtract the recommended limit to come up with the risk savings. So just like that, you can look at your field statistics and go over to the risk reduction, and you see you've just reduced your credit limit risk just on the single transaction limits by $429,000. So that's a pretty significant risk reduction in my mind. So we also want to look at the monthly limits because, of course, that's probably your bigger risk. I'll go back to the data here. I like to, after I've done a lot of analysis, I close all so that I can start fresh and make sure I have the files that I really want. So we're going to start back with the transaction file that has the credit limits already in it because I don't want to go through that whole process again. And now we're going to determine if the monthly limits are adequate. In order to do that, we're going to use a macro. I don't know if any of you have used those or not, but it's a wonderful way to really speed up the process. And this particular macro is actually provided by IDEA. And I'm just going to open that. If you have that saved in your project file, it's real easy. It jumps right to that. And this is a macro that will summarize the transactions or whatever it is you're analyzing by month. So I'm just going to click Run. It's going to ask me what file I want to use to do it. And then you have to tell it what fields you're going to look at. And this is the transaction date that we want. You want to look at what you need to total, and then the key field for summarization, which in this case, we want to be the employee ID. And just like that, it's going through all of our data, and it's giving me a summary by month for each employee. And there it is. Now you'll notice that this file does not have the employee name on it or the credit limits, so we're going to just add those back in. It's a pretty quick process. You just do a join, and we're going to use the same file we just used. And we're going to call this employee summary by month. And both these have the full employee ID. And in this case, again, we want all of the records from the primary file. So now all we've done is added the employee name and the credit limits back in. So our next step will be to determine which month and how much was the largest, we don't care which month, but what was the largest monthly spend for each employee. And if you went through this employee by employee, it would take you quite a while to do that. But there is a function in IDEA called @max. And that will return the maximum between two values. So in this case, because we're looking at 12 months, what this function will actually do is first it will look at January and February, and then whichever is the largest of that, it will compare with March, and then the largest of that, it will compare with April, on through till all of the months are taken into consideration. So it looks a little complicated, but again, I'm just going to copy this and paste it in so that you don't have to watch me, you don't have to watch me struggling through typing that. So we're going to append, we'll call this max spent. And there we have the maximum months. So if you look at Wendy, if you go across, you can see there in August was her maximum spend. So now again we're going to add the 50% limit just because that's what we use to determine whether or not the limits are appropriate. And this time we're going to use the monthly amount. And then do a direct extraction because again, we only want to take into consideration those limits that are greater than our minimum. And we're going to do a compound extraction this time. So we're going to look at, we only want those where the maximum spent is less than the 50% limit, and we only want those in which the monthly credit limit is greater than our standard. You'll remember on the single limit, I actually did that in 2 steps. In this case, we're going to do it in 1, just to show that you can do multiple criteria within a single extraction. And in this case, our minimum standard for the monthly limit is $5,000. All right, so once again, we have the 50% limit and we have the maximum spent and what their current monthly limit is. So what we want to determine is what their limit should be. So we're going to append another field. For the recommended limit. And this is another complicated if statement. This one, depending on the results that you have, you may actually need to look at your upper parameters and make some adjustments on that. You may have some people who need a little bit higher limit even than that. So you want to make sure when you make these recommendations and make these analyses that you are looking at your data to make sure that the recommendations would make sense. In this case, we had an upper limit of 50,000, but if someone's maximum monthly spend was 60,000, obviously a $50,000 limit wouldn't be appropriate for them. And then we'll append again the reduction. And again, you go to your field statistics. And there we have over $4 million reduction in the risk to the university by reducing these credit limits. Now, obviously, we're internal audit, and we don't say you will reduce these credit limits. But what we do, originally we did this as an annual audit of the entire university, but we actually look at it now at a departmental level. And then we go to the department and say, these are the people who are not utilizing the limits that they have, and we recommend that they be looked at for possible reduction. It's then entirely up to the department whether they want to make those reductions or not. The reality is you have a dean, you have a chair. Even if they're not utilizing their credit limit, the politics sometimes make it hard to make those reductions. So we do leave that up to the departments as to what recommendations they're going to make. And we've had people just take the list that we send them and they send that on to procurement and say make these adjustments. Other departments will go through their lists line by line and determine which ones they really need to eliminate. So I don't know if there are any questions at this point. Lindsay?
Most of the questions, sorry, hi Susan. Most of the questions have been about getting the different formulas you've been using. So
Okay.
as I've been telling certain people, but I'll just remind everybody, we are recording the webcast and we'll be sending out the slides, the recording, and then Susan also put together a really great document that outlines all of the different formulas they use in the different areas of their audit plans. And we'll be sending that out as well. So you guys will all be taken care of.
Okay. All right, so the one last step that we do is we want to look for cards that have no activity on them. If they've not had any activity on them in the past year, there's a real good chance that they don't really need to have a card. And sometimes employees get it for a one-time use and then they never have a need for it again. So you really want to get those cards closed up too, if at all possible. By utilizing a year's worth of data, you're going to take into consideration the entire academic year and include the summer in case they don't do activity except certain times of the year. Now I know some of our departments, people only get to travel every 2 years. So a lot of those people might show up on this list, but they really do need to keep their card. Or maybe you want to close it and open it back up when they do need it. That, again, is a management decision. We just provide them with the data. And so in order to do, let me close all of this out. I really like close all because you end up with so many files open that it starts to get confusing on what you're looking at. So our primary file in this case is going to be our credit limits because we want to see which of these people have no activity in the credit limit transaction file. And so we're going to do a join again. And our secondary is going to be It doesn't matter which transaction file you use, whether it has the credit limits or not in this case. And the fields we need here will be the first name and the last name. We're going to be providing this to management, so we want to make sure they're able to identify appropriately. And always use your ID if you have it, because we might have multiple names. And we're going to call this we're going to match with the employee ID. And the fields that we want from the secondary. Now you need to have, we're not really looking necessarily for data from this field, but we have to pick one field to pull from that. And what we're going to look for this time is any records in the primary file that do not have a corresponding record in the secondary file. So we want records with no secondary match. And now we have a list of cardholders with no activity. You can see here that we ended up, because we were using the credit limit listing, we only got those redacted employee IDs, so we could just do a join to get that full ID back in, using again the last 5, and we would have to create that field here. So that's all I really had on that. So I thought you might like to look at, since we have a little bit of time, is one way to create a macro. And if we go to our single limit here, so this is our file with their maximum single limit was less than 50%. And so those are the ones that we are recommending for reduction. In order, if I liked all the steps I went through on this, everything worked just the way I wanted it, I had everything the way it was, the easiest way to create a macro is to come to your history file. And each step that you do actually has IdeaScript code associated with it. So in order to do a new script, you just open this screen up, and you come in between the beginning and the end. I just want to go back and forth. So I'm probably going to do the import manually. But if you come down to the append field, you can just copy this and bring it into your script, and there you have created that activity. It will do it with one click of the button. And then you go to the next step. Now the one thing about these is you have to be careful when you're doing it in this manner, because you have to make sure that all of your file names are the same. If you change a file name even slightly, it will not work properly in your when you use your macro. And while this can be a little tedious, it's a lot less tedious than having to type this script out manually. And then you always have room for error. My typing's not always the best. And so you can see the number of steps that we actually took to do this process. In a little bit, I'll run it from the macro, and you'll see it takes a matter, generally, depending on your file type, of seconds to do what I just spent the last 40 minutes or so doing. And learning to do scripts has saved me so much time, because if it's something that you're going to be doing on a monthly basis, a weekly basis, quarterly basis, or even an annual basis, if you can just do it quickly using a macro, if it's the same all the time, there's no sense in having to redo the work over and over and over. So I'm going to call this and now we're going to actually run it. And you can see it's created a file. It says it already exists because I'm using the same folder. It's going to say that every time it creates a file. And there, just like that, what I just spent the last 43 minutes or so doing, it just did. You saw it in less than a minute. So macros are a great way to go. You actually can even pin the macros up here on your ribbon, so you don't even have to go out and find them. Or you can save them into your working folder, well, it used to be called the working folder, but the project file, so that they're all right there when you go to do the analysis. Then you don't have to go out and look for them. And it just really is a big time saver. That's really all that I had today. If anybody had any questions about IDEA in general or anything about this, we could certainly go over some of it. I do see what other types of audits and analysis have we done. Gosh, we do, obviously we do this. We use it to look to, a lot of times, determine our riskiest transactions within another audit, an operational audit. We indicate what type of transactions would be risky, and we can find those looking at a huge population. Something else I do every year is we do a risk assessment of our card holders. And so we use that complicated if statement to populate a risk ranking based on any number of criteria. Some of the things we look at are the number of transactions, the volume of transactions, certain transactions that we consider risky, such as business meals, if they have a high credit limit, those types of things. And that can be altered every year based on what we're looking for, what we figure is the most risky. We can look for certain types of vendors. If they use a lot of Amazon or a lot of eBay or PayPal, we can pull those out as well. And by using the IDEA, we can do that for all of the card holders in one step. So I can assign a ranking based on what their transactions are showing, just in a single step with IDEA. That's a lot of what we use it for. We also, of course, use it to pull statistical random samples. We currently are doing departmental P-card and travel audits. And so I do some data analysis there because a lot of the information is not readily available and visible to our departmental financial people. So I'll do an analysis on the top 10 cardholders and an analysis on our object codes so they can see where their money's being spent. And when I pull the top 10 cardholders, that's useful because to me, I don't know who should be spending a lot of money in their area, and sometimes they can be very surprised at who is. So that gives them something to look at and make sure that things seem to be operating as they expect. And so another question is talk about the different ways to customize macros using dialog boxes. And I've not done a lot of that, but you certainly can. So remember I said that if your file name is a little bit different, it will mess up your analysis. Your macro will not work correctly. And so you can put a dialog box to specify the file name. And we have a couple of that that comes in very useful. So you can input, we actually have our monthly audits. We do monthly audits of grants, monthly audits of foundation, and we pull a random sample. And so the macro lets me input the random seed for that random sample. Just things like that. There anything that really anything that you can do in scripting, you can do in Idea Script if you know how to do it. I will admit that I'm not a strong scripter, but I am learning, and we do have an IT auditor in our office who helps me out with that a lot too.
Along that same line, Susan, if you have questions or if your macro is not quite working the way you'd like, the help desk team can also help you with that. It is a pretty, again, if you know what to type in, it's a pretty simple thing to do. Honestly, I can't remember the exact way to do it right now, but if you talk to the help desk, they can help sort that out with you as well.
The help desk is an invaluable resource. They have helped me, I can't tell you the number of times. They will help you do what you want to do. A lot of times I know that Idea can do it. I've never done it. I've never seen it done. I just can't think how to do it. A call to them will get you right on track. They've helped me with scripts. They've helped me figuring out what function to use to accomplish what I want. They one time even provided me with a macro, the random sample by group. Random samples normally are based on a number or something like that. So we, in our departmental audits, each department has multiple organization numbers. And so we wanted to pull a certain number from each organization within that department so that we get full coverage. If we just pull a random sample from the entire population for a department, we may not see a single transaction from this organization or this organization within that department just because of the nature of randomness. So by creating that random sample by group, it was a big help to us so we could use a macro to do that rather than my having to go in. And my other option prior to that was to do a key value extraction. So I got a separate database for each organization, and then I had to go into each of those separate databases and run a random sample on that database to get and then I would have to merge them all to get my entire population. It was pretty time consuming to do that. So by creating that macro, now in one click, it just pulls whatever number it asks me what file name I want to use, how many I want to pick from each key field, and I input the random seed. And then I'm done.
Thank you for sharing with us, Susan. If you have any other questions, please go ahead and enter them in the question box. While you are thinking of anything else you'd like to ask, I'm going to do a little pitch for speakers. These ACUA virtual user groups are done quarterly. They're for only ACUA members, and we try to have other ACUA members as the speakers. So we'd love to hear from you. There's no topic too complicated, too easy, too out there. I can guarantee there's probably a handful of other auditors that could learn from what you're doing. So if you are interested in presenting one of these webcasts for us, we would love to hear from you. You can reach out to me directly at marketing@automation.com. I am not seeing any other questions, so
I do see one more there, Lindsay, about macros. It says you would use them typically only for repetitive analysis using the same file names, right? Not necessarily. You might create some small macros that would do just so when you, if you're always going to, it would definitely only be for repetitive tasks, but it might not be for an entire project like I just showed you. So it may just be one piece of that analysis that you do over and over. Say you typically have to append a field to all of your transactions for some purpose. You can write a macro just for that. It's a small piece, and it may not take you that long to actually enter the formulas to do it, but anything that you're doing over and over, taking the time to create a macro will speed that process along. And again, your file names don't have to be the same. You just have to put in a box that will allow you to enter the file name if the file name is going to vary from each time. I've actually set up, we do, as I said, we do monthly audits, and we have our macros set up to do those. And what it does is it pulls our file names. For example, our grant file for October would be called OCT 15 grants. And the next month it would be NOV 15 grants. So we set up, and each month goes into a separate folder. So we set up the macro to pull that, like October 15, from the folder name. So all I have to do is set up the folder name, and then when I can run the macros, it will create, so it creates a prefix of that month and year and appends it to whatever I tell the file to be called. Does that make sense, I hope?
Yes, it makes sense, and to me, so that's usually good because, you know, I'm in the marketing department.
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing any other questions. I appreciate you sharing your techniques with us. And if you have any questions, you can contact the help desk. You can contact me, again, Lindsay F. at automation.com or marketing@automation.com. And if you have any questions for me or for Susan, I can make sure that those get routed to the correct place. So thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us for our next webcast in January. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.